Welcome to the first in a new series. Actually, this series itself is sort of part two of a study through a huge chunk of the Old Testament and a big piece of the life of Israel. Let me give you a little review, and I'm going to pull up a map because we've been looking at Israel through the Old Testament. Let me show you what I mean. Here's a map of Israel in ancient times. And we started about 1000 BC when this whole kingdom was united under King David and then his son, King Solomon. Solomon died in 930 BC. And when Solomon died, the kingdom of Israel split in two. There were 10 tribes in the north that for economic and political reasons broke with the two tribes in the south, and they became literally two nations, all Jews, but two different nations. And that went on all the way down through history to 586 BC. And in 586 BC, over that 300 plus year period, our last series examined the faith of the kings of Israel and how faith encountered circumstances and sometimes overcame and sometimes failed. And hopefully we drew a lot of timely lessons for us as to how our faith encounters our circumstances of life. Well, in 586 BC, in the Old Testament, in the history of the Jews, in the life of ancient Israel, a cataclysmic event occurred. And that was the destruction of Jerusalem, tore down its walls, burned all the major cities, burned the temple, and deported most of the Jews who were left into other parts of the world. And this was done by the kingdom of Babylon, what's modern day Iraq. And so in this second series, I want to continue through the Old Testament, and I want to continue with that story of the exile and then the return from exile. And so we call this coming home. And one of the key books that talks about this is Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is a great study of rebuilding. It's a great study of leadership, and it's a great study, again, of how faith can rebuild the future of a people. So that's what we're going to talk about. Let me show you a brief timeline. So in our original Stories from the Kings of Israel, on the top part, we went from about 1000 BC to 586. And in your Old Testament, by the way, your English Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, which we call the Old Testament, they don't, of course, the Jewish Bible has the same books as your Protestant Old Testament has. They just have them in a different order. In your and my Old Testament, we've got the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then you start, they're kind of in historical order. You have Joshua, then Judges, and 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings and Chronicles, and that's where we were. We were in the books of Kings and Chronicles. Well, after you get through all the books of history, and that goes all the way through Ezra and Nehemiah, and we're just going to track through those historical books, but along the way, at the back of our Old Testament, we put all the prophets together. Think Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, and then there are 12 other lesser-known prophetic books. And they are scattered in historically, and so we're just going to bring them in when they make sense. For example, we saw Isaiah and Jeremiah who lived in the times of the kings, and we saw them prophesying. Nahum, who prophesied, as did Habakkuk, against the Assyrians, who destroyed one of those two kingdoms of Israel. And so the prophets were living in amongst this history. And one of the things the prophets did was they interpreted the meaning of events to the people. And so you'll see in Kings and Chronicles and in Ezra and Nehemiah, you'll see the flow of history and what's happening to Israel. And then all of the prophetic books are there interpreting. God is speaking to his people, making sense of what is happening in the world. And so in this series, called Going Home, we're going to start in 586, and the Jews are at their low point. In fact, they should disappear from history at this point, but they don't, and we'll talk about that. And so they're in exile until 539 BC, and then they go back. Well, Ezra and Nehemiah are two books in your Old Testament that tell the story of going back and rebuilding the temple and rebuilding Jerusalem. And I want to focus on that, but along the way, Daniel lived in that time. Ezekiel lived in that time. Zechariah, another smaller prophetic book, and Malachi lived in that time, and they spoke into those events. And so we'll incorporate the prophets into this. So we find ourselves with, this is a map of the Babylonian Empire. And so this is Babylon, conquered the Assyrians, conquered the whole Middle East, certainly conquered what's the modern state of Israel, and in 586 BC, destroyed Jerusalem and spread the Jews all over the Babylonian Empire. A big portion of them went to just south, where it's called the Kibar Canal. That area south of Babylon is where a number of the Jews were settled, and Ezekiel the prophet was there with those Jewish exiles. Babylon, the capital city, which is very near Baghdad, modern-day Baghdad, is where the prophet Daniel, who was taken there as a young man to become a part of Babylonian society, to become a civil servant, if you will. In 586, the key player in the world, let me introduce you to King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar reigned Babylon from 605 BC until 562 BC, and Babylon reached its height under his rule. He was not a nice guy, but he was a very successful guy, and he conquered a great deal of the known world at that time. And his story colors that time period of the exile. So he brings the Jews back to Babylon in actually several waves of exiles, the biggest one being in 586 when he finally destroys the whole place and removes everybody that's left. But King Nebuchadnezzar figures all through the book of Daniel, because Daniel is someone who was taken as a young boy and lived his whole life, all the rest of his life, in Babylon, in exile, amongst the Babylonians. He went there when they were at their peak of power, and he was there when they were overthrown. Ezekiel was taken also with a group, and God used him to speak words of sadness, but also words of hope to the Jewish exiles at that time. And he too lived a great deal of his life in exile. So where are we? In this lesson, I want to talk about the time period of Nebuchadnezzar, and I want to talk about this top line, and that is the time of exile. From 586 to 539, all the Jews were in exile, and then in 539, the Persian king Cyrus changes everything. And so then, as we move on, I want to spend a lot of time with Ezra and particularly Nehemiah in the time period between 538 and 445. And this is about when your Old Testament story ends, by the way. Then there's a gap, and then you have the cross of Christ. And so we'll finish this series where the Old Testament finishes. But for this lesson, I want to focus on this time period of exile. And I want to look at what happened there through the eyes of two of the people who experienced it. Let me introduce you to the first one. His name is Daniel. And in the book of Daniel, chapter 1, we read his story. He says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar took some people from Judah, from Israel, back to Babylon as hostages for good behavior. The date of this is 605 BC. Now remember, he won't completely destroy the place till 586, but these were warnings to them. I'm going to take some hostages, pay your taxes, don't rebel. But then they would do it again, and so he would take more hostages, and then finally, he decided, enough of this. I'm destroying your temple, destroying your capital city, and you guys are all being deported into exile. But in 605, he took some of the cream of the crop, the best and the brightest of the young men and women in Jerusalem. It says, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, and he besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim into his hand. In other words, he conquered it. But instead of destroying it, they paid him articles from the temple of God, and he took them off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put the treasure house of his God. In other words, they gave him all the treasure in the temple and said, don't destroy us. We promise we'll be good from now on. We'll be good citizens for you. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his royal officials, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. These would be the best educated. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for learning, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was going to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. It's like taking them back to Babylon and having them go through college there. And then they would go and serve in the Babylonian government because the Babylonians needed talent to administer this vast empire that they had accumulated. So the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they'd enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah, a young man named Daniel and 3 of his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Let me notice one thing here for you. All of these names are just good Jewish names. This El in the end of Mishael and Daniel, that means God. So for example, Daniel means God is my judge. And so it's talking about the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, etc. So that El ending is a sign of a Jewish name, if you will. The Yah ending, the IAH on Hananiah and Azariah, is the beginning of the name of God, Yahweh. And so those are also religious names. It'd be like naming, we don't really do this that much today, but it would be like a kid named Jesus or a kid named Christian or whatever. It just incorporates the name of your God, and it's sort of a biblical name, if you want to think about it that way. It gives a sense to your ethnicity and your religion. Well, one of the things the Babylonians did was they renamed them, and he gave them the names. To Daniel, he was called Belteshazzar. Let me show you something here. That Bel, B-E-L, is one of the Babylonian gods. And so he changed his name, but he also gave him a name that's a good Babylonian god name. So he named him Belteshazzar. And Hananiah was called Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, and Azariah was called Abednego. And Nego was another Babylonian god. So let me pause there for a second because this has really interesting implications for us. So these Jewish boys were being taken into the Babylonian culture. It was the most powerful culture at the time, the most powerful government at the time. And this renaming ceremony, very powerful thing to do. What was Babylon saying to them? Your God is a failure. Our God is more powerful. And so your name is even going to reflect the power of our gods. Think of it this way. Think of it as assimilation, acculturation. In other words, it's like sending your kids to public school. And at public schools in Babylon, they were going to teach them about the Babylonian gods. And in fact, the same thing happens to us today to a large extent. When you send your kids to public school, they're being acculturated with the predominant ideas of our culture. Some of those are Christian, many of those are not. And so the same thing's happening here, but literally renaming someone is a dominance kind of a thing to do. And Babylon was a very dominant culture, very dominant power in the world. So in 605 BC, Daniel is a young man. It's hard to know exactly how old he is, but say somewhere between like 14 and 18. I mean, somewhere in that era where he would like go to college. He would go be trained. So, Ezekiel, also right around this time, is in Judah, in Israel. And as you open the book of Ezekiel, you see his story. In the 5th month, 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim, this is 593 BC. So think about it, it's 12 years later. Daniel's already in Babylon. Israelites, 12 years later, act up again. They come and they say, we're taking more of your people away. this is your last warning. And it was their last warning, because 7 years later in 586, they'd rebel again, and they came and destroyed the place. But Ezekiel and a group of the Jews were taken, and they were taken to the Kibar River near Babylon in the land of the Babylonians. And there, the hand of the Lord was on Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a priest. And so he was working at the temple, and he was taken away, and he ministered to the people in exile. And God spoke to him and said, I want you to minister to these people. I want you to tell them some things for me. What was he to tell them? Let's go on. Chapter 2, God said to me, Son of man, which is a phrase for Ezekiel, he said, stand on your feet and I will speak to you. And as he spoke, the Spirit came into me and raised me to my feet, and I heard him speaking to me. He said, Son of man, I'm sending you to the Israelites, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. They and their fathers have been in revolt against me to this very day. The people to whom I'm sending you are obstinate and stubborn. Now that's a fair evaluation. Think about this. We're in 593 BC, Jerusalem's about to be destroyed. Ever since 1000 BC, God sent prophets warning them, be faithful, keep your promises to God, keep your covenant with God, follow him, don't go away after the idols. And what happened? There were times when they were faithful, but overall, they were not faithful. And so here comes this judgment, if you will. The consequences of that, of God leaving them to their own resources. I mean, think about it. They didn't want to go into exile. They were rebelling because they thought they could beat the Babylonians, just like they thought they could beat the Assyrians before them, and they were wrong. God said, left to your own devices, this is what's happened. I can't help but say to you, that's so true in a personal sense for many of us. I don't know about you, but before I became a Christian, which was later in my life, I was living my life the way I wanted to live my life. I was kind of like these Israelites. It's like I knew there was a God, but I thought, I can handle this. And you know, the time comes in our lives, usually, if we're fortunate, when we come to our senses and realize, no, I can't really handle this. And that's what happened to Israel. Things worked out, left to their own devices, not for good, but for ill. And so God then doesn't forget them. He sends Ezekiel to them, and he says, you're going to speak straight to these people. Tell them that they are obstinate and stubborn, and say this to them. This is what the Lord says. Whether they listen or they don't listen, that's not your issue. You just go speak, which, by the way, is great advice for Christians. We're not responsible for whether people believe the good news about Jesus Christ, but we are very much responsible to lovingly and compassionately speak that message to the world. Well, that's what he told Ezekiel. He says, you just go tell them what I'm saying. He says, don't be afraid, even though it's going to be a very difficult life, and that is true. He had a lot of hardship. He says, don't be afraid of what they say, or don't be terrified of them, because they are rebellious people. You just speak my words to them, whether they listen or not. Then I looked and I saw a hand stretched out to me, and in it was a scroll. And this is a vision. Ezekiel has apocalyptic visions. I mean, just spectacular visions from God. And he unrolled the scroll before me, and on both sides of it were written words of lament and mourning and woe. And as it goes on, he says in the vision, eat this scroll. And he does, and he said, it tasted sweet in my mouth, but then it was very bitter in his stomach, because these words are words of woe. These words are words to Israel of, this is what your running your own life has gotten you. This is what your unfaithfulness has led you to. That's the context of this exile. It's the context of the story of Israel as we hit 586 BC. So, what I'd like to do is I want to look at in Babylon, and then here's where Ezekiel and the others are, down here just south of Babylon. And I want to look at a couple of stories from this time of the exile. And the stories in the book of Daniel are magnificent. The first 6 chapters of Daniel, I would urge you to go read. I'm going to tell you one story out of those 6 chapters that happened to him and his friends. The latter 6 chapters of Daniel are visions. And they're a little harder to understand, but the first 6 chapters are just stories of what happened during this time from 586 to 539 BC. So from this, basically from this 40-some year period of time, very tight period of time there. So first story I want to tell you is during King Nebuchadnezzar's reign, he was very successful. And when he came back from conquering most of the known world, he basically set up a bunch of PR, a bunch of social media posts of, I am the greatest king that has ever lived. He built a magnificent palace in Babylon. He rebuilt the city into an amazing capital. The city had a river running right through the middle of it. It was gorgeous, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But he also made an image of gold 90 feet high and 9 feet wide, and he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he summoned all of the satraps and governors, in other words, all the officials from all over the empire to come. And what he's going to do is he's going to have them, he built this image, and what is the image? The image is an image of him. He is godlike. He is building an image of himself, and he's bringing in all the governors and all the mayors and everybody throughout the kingdom, and he says, I want you to bow down to me. Smart move. Evil, but smart. Because what he's doing is he's basically saying, you have allegiance to me as a political ruler because I have power. I have the army behind me. But I also want you to give me your personal allegiance as though it is your faith, your religious allegiance to me, because I am a God. So he wants to take the religious life of the people and the political life and put the two together and say, I am everything. You're not going to have gods and government. It's all going to be the same thing. And so pretty smart move on his part to consolidate his power. And so he brought them all in, and the herald proclaimed, this is what you're commanded to do. O peoples, nations, and men of every language. I mean, this is a very multi-ethnic empire because they conquered a lot of the known world. As soon as you hear the sound of all this music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. Why a blazing furnace? Well, basically what he's saying is if you aren't going to worship me, you're going to die. In other words, it's going to be really obvious here. I have the power of life and death like a God, and if you will not serve me, you will be destroyed as though the power of a God. Why a furnace? Because it's a grisly way to die. And he's like, well, all I need is to throw 1 or 2 people in there, and I think everybody else will shape up here. And so the idea of the furnace is it's kind of spectacular and it's pretty intimidating, right? Well, at this time, some of the astrologers, Babylonians, big time into wisdom, astrology, that kind of thing. In fact, fast forward, remember the 3 magi, the 3 wise men who saw the star and followed it? Very much inheritors of this tradition. They were astrologers, they were wise men, they were looking for signs. They were not Jewish people, they weren't Christians, but God used them to bring attention to what he was doing. So these are their forefathers, if you will, these astrologers. They came forth and they denounced the Jews. And they said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You've issued a decree that everyone who hears the sounds of the music should fall down and worship the image that you set up. And whoever does not will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have elevated into your government, specifically Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you have set up. Now, lesson number 1, no one likes a tattletale. All right, so what are these guys doing? This is pure envy, jealousy, political maneuvering. They're like, hey, these Jews probably aren't going to do this. I'm going to get them in trouble. Never waste a good crisis. Here we have this crisis of we all have to bow down. Might as well get rid of some of my enemies. And that is kind of the way God's people have been treated throughout history. So he says that. Well, furious with rage, King Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. So they were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I set up? Now listen here. When you hear the sound of the music, fall down and worship the image. And if so, that's good. But if not, I will throw you into this blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? What's he saying? This isn't just the power of the government. This isn't just saying, look, he could have said this. He could have said, look, there's a law here. And that's the law. And I understand you guys don't want to obey the law, but if you don't obey the law, we're going to have to put you in jail. It's going to be civil disobedience. Way beyond that. What he's saying in this is, I have the power of life and death more than your God does. You know, I can kill you. I have power. Reminds me of something Jesus said, by the way, which is going to be just as true in this story as it is in our lives. Jesus said this, don't fear those who can kill your body and can't do anything else to you. If you want to fear anybody, fear him who not only can kill your body, but can send your soul into hell. And that is that men are not gods. Government are not gods. Their power is more limited than they realize. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego understand this. And so here's what they say. One of the most faithful things ever said in the Bible. O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the furnace, the God we save is able. The God we serve is able to save us from it. And he will rescue us from your hand. That's what we believe, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know that we cannot serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. Well, I want to pause there for a second, because I want to tell you this is an interesting story in this sense, and here's how it relates to you and me. So you get these Jewish people, they go into a culture that's not their own. They're in exile. In other words, this is not their native land. Fast forward, New Testament, book of Peter says to this is not your native land, he said. You are sojourners here. In other words, this isn't your ultimate home. We as Christians very much pick up that image of we are in a land that is not our native land. Heaven is our home. Being with God in his kingdom is our nationality. And so you see this idea of the Christian life very much being patterned on a cosmic scale after this historical event. And so what do they say? They realize, look, we're being pressed on every side to accommodate this culture. And now we're being pressed to bow down before the gods of this culture. Habakkuk the prophet said a little bit before this. He's famous for, well, actually, he didn't say it. God said it, and he told Israel this. It says this, the righteous will live by faith. Let me change that to be a little more accurate translation. The righteous will live by being faithful. The righteous will live faithful lives. And that's the essence of the challenge for anyone who is in a culture that is pressing them. And so what do these young men do? They are faithful. Now, if Nebuchadnezzar had said, I've raised taxes 10%, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would have said, man, that's hard and I really don't agree, but I will pay your taxes. If Nebuchadnezzar had said to them, you know, we have a rule and nobody can go out on Tuesdays anymore, right? It's going to be like a Sabbath to my gods and no one can open their stores. Then they would not open their stores on Tuesday. But this crosses a line, doesn't it? This crosses the line to where does your allegiance lay? Bow down before my gods. Put my gods and claim that they are real. And that's where faithful men had to say, we cannot bow down before your gods. And so they were faithful to God. They were good citizens. In fact, they were civil servants, but they would not turn from their gods to idols. And the same challenge is here for us today. Do we become good citizens where we live? Sure. Romans chapter 13 says, be good citizens. Follow the laws that you're given, unless it crosses into idolatry and the idea that you're going to bow down before these gods. If you think about the history of the church, that's always been the line. They come to Jesus and they said, Jesus, should we pay our taxes to Caesar or not? and he said, Caesar's coin, pay your taxes to Caesar. Christians after that were not only asked to pay taxes to Caesar, very shortly after that, they were asked to swear that Caesar is Lord. That means you are the Lord of the universe, you're God. Christians wouldn't do that. Christians were killed by the tens of thousands for 200 years because they would not do that. They'll pay your taxes, they'll follow the laws, but they will not say Caesar is Lord. You see that pattern throughout all of the Old Testament, all of the New Testament, and all of the history of the church. The righteous will live faithful lives. And that's why we say here that we want to live by faith. What does that mean? What it means is that when you come right down to it, our allegiance is to God and no other idol of any kind. An idol that I set up, my greed, my pride, an idol that the government sets up. Nothing else can demand our allegiance, and we won't bow down to it. And so these three young men teach us a lesson from 2,500 years ago that the righteous will live by faith. Well, there's so many good stories of basically every story in Daniel is a story of the culture trying to pull them away from God. And the beauty of the story of the exiles, the Jewish exiles, the reason they did not go down in history as just being assimilated into the culture and going away is that they drew the line and said, we will worship God and God alone. Think about the fundamental confession of the faith of the Jews is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. In other words, there's only one God. What's the fundamental confession of the faith for Christians? Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. That is a confession that we will not deny. Well, as time goes on in the exile, Nebuchadnezzar ruled till 562, and he was very powerful. But after Nebuchadnezzar, things went downhill really quickly. You ever seen families that have a lot of influence and, kind of come from old money, whatever, and you realize that after a couple of generations, every now and then you get some people that just aren't very capable. I mean, you look at the kings of England and what happened there. You look at some of the barons of American history and the nobility, and you realize that as Nebuchadnezzar hands us down to son and grandson and great-grandson, you get to a point where you get some kings that aren't very capable. Here's the problem. Nobody after Nebuchadnezzar was a very good king. And so you go down to Nabonidus. Nabonidus ruled from 556, just a few years after Nebuchadnezzar died, until he basically ran the kingdom into the ground. They're going to be destroyed in 539, and he presides over it. He basically recorded, we know a lot about Nabonidus. That thing on the left of the picture is a kind of a clay impression of Babylonian writing. That chicken scratching there is Babylonian cuneiform, and so you can interpret that, and you can read some of the things that Nabonidus did. Nabonidus basically spent more time in his summer home than he did doing business. In fact, it got so bad that his son, whose name is Belshazzar, is left in Babylon running things. He's off on a pleasure cruise. And so in 539 BC, as they've totally neglected the kingdom and so forth, Babylon gets its own judgment, if you will. Babylon conquered so many lands. Babylon was such a symbol of power and oppression, and Babylon itself is judged and destroyed in 539 BC, and it comes largely because they just stopped paying attention. So there's a brilliant little story about Nabonidus' son. He's in Babylon, and all it appears that he does is have feasts and parties. His dad is off on a cruise. The Persian army is threatening. In fact, the Persian army is within sight of Babylon when this happens. Chapter 5 of the book of Daniel. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. Whenever the Bible says drank wine with them, it means they all got drunk. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. It says Nebuchadnezzar, his father, meaning his ancestor, probably his grandfather. And so he took them from the temple in Jerusalem. Well, we remember that. He got those, remember, when he was threatening to destroy the place, and they said, here, take everything out of the temple. We got tons of gold, we got tons of silver. Take that, we promise we'll be good citizens. Well, he took it back to Babylon. Well, here we are about 60 years later, and he says, hey, bring out all that stuff from the conquered people. We're gonna use that. We're gonna use our good dishes tonight, right? So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines drank from them. And they drank the wine, and they praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone. In other words, not only are they trash talking the temple of Jerusalem by, eating off the stuff that's supposed to be holy and in the temple. And while they're doing it, they're praising the idols of their lives. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. By the way, interesting, minor little historical note. Archaeology doesn't have a record of, it's not like, oh, wow, there's the writing on the wall. Didn't find that. But they did plaster their walls. In other words, all these little details in the Bible just really check out in small ways as well as big ways. So he saw a hand writing in the plaster on the wall, and the king watched the hand as it wrote, and his face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. Okay, this is not the image of Nebuchadnezzar, the conquering king. This is the image of a weak, pathetic king who is afraid. Now, admittedly, having a disembodied hand writing on your wall, okay, that's pretty impressive. That's kind of scary. Nevertheless, you see the weakness of this system of rule, and you see the weakness of this king, Belshazzar. So the king watched as it wrote, was scared to death, called for the enchanters, called for the astrologers and the diviners to be brought. And he said to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing tells me what it means. I'll clothe you in purple, put a gold chain around your neck. You'll be made third highest ruler in the kingdom. Why third? Well, his dad Nabonidus was one, and he is number two. He says, you're gonna be my right-hand man if you can tell me what in the world is going on here, right? And so he brings them in. By the way, I can't help think about this passage in 1 Corinthians. Think about this. You get this idea of the wisdom of the world. So what does he do? Go get me all the Harvard professors, go get me the astrologers, get me all the wisest people in the kingdom. Tell me what in the world is going on here. Now remember early in this lesson I said, what was the function of the prophets of God? The function of the prophets of God were to hear God's voice, and what God spoke through them was, what do these things mean? And so he turns to the world, and there's this great passage that says, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Has not God confounded the wisdom of this world with the foolishness of what we preach? Still true today. Anyway, he gets all the wise men in. Needless to say, they cannot figure it out. And the king's wise men came, but they couldn't read the writing. They couldn't tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale, and his nobles were baffled. So, life lesson here. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you call in the wisest men that you know, and you can't figure out what is going on there, what do? Obviously, it's time for a woman. And so, the queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. And she said, "O king, live forever." And so here's this, absolutely terrified king. Here comes the queen, takes command of the situation, and figures out what to do. She said, "There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the gods in him. In the time of Nebuchadnezzar, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom. King Nebuchadnezzar appointed him the chief of all the wise men of Babylon. This man named Daniel was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding and the ability to interpret dreams and explain riddles and solve difficult problems." Call for Daniel. He will tell you what the writing means. Now think about this. This is 539. Daniel came to Babylon in 605. He was a young man then. He's got to be in his 80s at this point. So, and that in those days particularly, that is amazing that he lived that long. So he's an old man now, and he saw the beginning of the Babylonian Empire, and on this day he will see its end. And so Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and you have insight and wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing, but they could not. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, then I will clothe you in purple, put a gold chain around your neck, and you will be made third highest in the kingdom." Wow, that's an opportunity, isn't it? I mean, stop and think. Daniel could be thinking, man, once I get to be third in the kingdom, I'll do all kinds of great evangelism here. But that's not the way Daniel looks at it. Daniel is going to make a point about the truth of God. He doesn't see it as an opportunity. He sees the situation itself. And so Daniel, the old man, answers. This guy's got a lot of chutzpah. That's what they say in Hebrew, chutzpah. Got a lot of guts. Or he's just a curmudgeon. He says, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give the rewards to somebody else." I mean, seriously, he's telling the king, like, I don't want your stuff. Now, before we finish this, I got to tell you, I can't wait to get to the point in my life where I can be this grumpy and get away with it. I mean, I don't know how old it is. Maybe you can email me and tell me, is that going to be 70? Is it going to be 80? When can you do this? Well, whenever it was, Daniel was at that point in his life. He said, you can keep your stuff, but I tell you what, I will read the writing for the king, and I will tell you what it means. Rembrandt painted this scene as best he could envision it, of the king Belshazzar seeing the writing on the wall. What that Hebrew writing on the wall says is, and it's in your Bibles, Mene, Mene, Tekel Uparsin. And so Daniel says, that's what this says, and let me tell you what it means. It means that the days of your kingdom were numbered, and they have come to an end. It says you have been weighed in the balance, and you have been found wanting. And it says that the Persians are at your gate, and your kingdom has been given over to them. And so, that very night, the Persian army conquered the city of Babylon and went on to conquer the entire kingdom. How did they conquer the city of Babylon? I mean, Babylon was an impressive defensive city. That they were so lax that what the Persians did was there was the river, Tigris, running right through it. They dammed it up and put the last chunk in place. The river quit running, and they ran their whole army right down the riverbed, right into the city. And so that event looks like just really bad military strategy. But what God says in this prophecy, remember this is Daniel saying, let me explain to you, let me explain to the Israelites, let me explain to you Christians 2,500 years later what this means. It means that Nebuchadnezzar, Nabonidus, Belshazzar, all the kings of the earth, all the powerful governments of the earth, you rule only at God's pleasure, meaning you come and you go, not by your own power and by your own hand. All of history bends to God's plan. And the Persians conquering Babylon was in God's plan. Why? Well, meanwhile, Ezekiel is sitting with this group of exiles, this community of exiles, as the Persian army comes in and wondering what is going on here. And here is how God tells Ezekiel to explain to them what is the meaning of what's going on now. Therefore, God says to Ezekiel, speak this. This is what the sovereign Lord says. The sovereign Lord. Why does he say that? He doesn't say that very often. He says that to say, you think this is up to the Babylonians and the Persians. God is the one orchestrating all of history. These guys do this for their own reasons, but they don't realize they're dancing to God's tune, and that's still true today. He says, although I sent them far away among the nations, talking about the Jews, and scattered them among the countries, yet for a little while I have been a sanctuary for them in the countries where they have gone. Therefore say this is what the sovereign Lord says, I will gather you from the nations, and I will bring you back from the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you back the land of Israel again. Now, if you're sitting there, you realize that's not possible. There's no geopolitical event that we can imagine that ends up with us back in the land of Israel. And yet, God speaks to them and says, the things you see happening, this is what they mean. It means I will gather you from where you've been scattered. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. You will return to it. You will remove all the idols. I will give you an undivided heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove your heart of stone. This is a great passage, by the way. I'll remove your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. Then they will follow my decrees and keep my laws. They will be my people, and I will be their God. As much as you see God working through the history of the Old Testament and the brutality and the power and the conquest, and by the way, that's not limited to the Old Testament. You look at our newspapers today and you see brutality and conquest and power and evil and ugliness happening in the world. And right here, piercing through that, like a ray of sunshine coming out of a storm, is the love of God for his people. Whether it was the Jewish people in this era or it's the followers of his son, Jesus Christ, in the 21st century. God says, you will be my people and I will be your God. But as for those whose hearts are devoted to their images and their idols, I will bring down on their own heads what they have done, declares the sovereign Lord. And so in the midst of this exile, in the midst of all this pressure, the one thing the Jewish people do, and they're faithful, is kind of exemplified in Ezekiel. He continues to speak the word of God. It's exemplified in Daniel, who speaks boldly the truth, literally in the face of the most powerful man in his world. They're faithful, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who says, we will not bow down to your gods. That lesson echoes through the centuries to us. What does God want from us? Faithfulness, obedience to him, and trust that he will work in history for good. Romans 8:28 is spoken to us. For in all circumstances, God works for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose, for his people, if you will. That was true in 539 BC, and it's true in 2020. It's just as true today as it was then. God expects the same thing. He doesn't expect us to be successful. He doesn't expect us to elect all Christians to our government. He doesn't expect us to live in a country that does everything right, that does everything just. What he expects is for us to be faithful in our world. And I love this time period of history, this exile, because what God does is he takes those people out of their comfort zone and he puts them in a hostile environment, and that's where you find out, are they really faithful? And I think about us in an increasingly hostile world. And I mean that in terms of increasingly warlike, but more so in terms of increasingly pressuring everyone to conform to the ideas of the culture, to the idols of the culture. And I feel like we too are in a time period of exile, if you will, and it's a time to hone our faithfulness to God. And that's what we're going to see in this time period, is we're going to see the Israelites, what happens when you actually trust God, even when it looks like nothing is going your way. And I can't think of a more timely lesson for you and me than that. In our next lesson, the exile ends and God brings a Persian savior for Israel. And I'd really like to explore how God uses governments, organizations, events that are not godly things to propel his people where he wants us to go. That's what we'll talk about next time. We'll meet Cyrus the Persian, who literally and unknowingly changes the future of God's people.